Dead faces in the water. Dead faces everywhere. Chapter 15. Rivendell. Summary. Won't someone think of the children? There are no sounds of childish laughter coming from the open windows as Elrond walks up the winding path to the door of the Elros foster home. But that lack does not concern him due to what he does hear: music. Specifically, the music of one harp and two soft voices mingled together in melodic sublimity. The children are surely all gathered around to listen, for while their home rings with music almost as often as it does with laughter and the shouts of childish conflicts, this particular music is a rare thing and precious. Elrond cannot help but smile, dire though the purpose of his visit today is, at the lovely sound. When he walks into the main gathering room, an open space lit by tall windows and festooned with soft chairs and cushions and lined with many shelves of books and toys alike, a comfortable, homely space for these children to grow and learn, he finds 5 of the current fosters sprawled out on the floor, their faces turned toward the singers with rapt fascination. The children range in age from 4 to 16, all of them human. While the Elros foster home accepts children of any kind, they even had 2 orcs once, many years ago. Humans are by far the residents most often to be found running up and down its halls. They are such a fragile species, humans, Elrond thinks mournfully. For all their strengths, they are still so fleeting. Neither of the singers are human, though one of them has human blood in her ancestry. The 2 of them evince a certain superficial similarity, with their long dark hair and delicate features, although the resemblance is a quickly passing thing. The taller and older is an elf, whose dark eyes still gleam with the lost light of the 2 trees, and his once handsome face has been made gaunt and grim with many sorrows. The younger and paler of the 2 is a Perethil, whose lovely face is still soft and kind, and whose clear gray eyes are warm with love. They are 2 of the people that Elrond holds dearest in all the world. They are sharing the one harp, their shoulders pressed close together, and each with one hand dancing across the strings. Their fingers move in perfect harmony, their voices entwining in a way that is nearly divine, and Elrond feels the weight upon his heart lighten as he listens. His task here today is a grim one, grim and urgent, but he does not interrupt the song. He does not want to disturb the children. 2, he cannot bear to destroy something that is crafted from such love as these strains of gentle, wistful music. The first of the singers to catch sight of him is his daughter, and Arwen smiles a greeting, but her hands and voice do not waver in their work, and Elrond is glad. It is not often that Arwen lets herself be coaxed into participating in these duets. She does not believe that her skill compares to that of Maglor Macalaure, and she has confessed many times that she holds it something of an audacity for her to play beside him as though it does. Elrond knows that his foster father finds Arwen's voice a delight, comparatively raw and untrained though it is when measured against his own more experienced tones. He knows that Maglor treasures the strength and hopefulness of Arwen's voice more than he does his own masterful but sorrowful one, and that he is always glad to share his harp with her. Indeed, she is the only one who can blend her playing with his well enough to produce such a duet as that which wafts through the Elros foster home this day. Maglor's right hand lost most of its dexterity long years ago, and he can no longer pluck harp strings with the scarred and blackened fingers. Mostly he plays his harp with one hand now, fingering the melody alone. Only when Arwen joins him at the instrument can the second line of strings be added back into his songs. When they finish, and the ringing of the final notes have been allowed to fade to silence, there is cheering from the children, which quickly turns to groans and pleas when it becomes clear that their singers mean to play no more that day. Maglor leaves Arwen to soothe the children and shoo them off to other pursuits. He also leaves the ancient harp where it stands, striding across the room to Elrond's side without delay. The moment he steps away from the harp, Maglor's shoulders droop back into their habitual, indrawn hunch, and by the time he reaches Elrond's side, his bowed head and doleful mien have pulled him down enough that he stands shorter than the Perethel's shoulders, although he would be hardly half a hand shorter than Elrond if he ever dared face the world head-on again. Elrond has not seen his foster father look upon Middle-earth with anything but guilt and sorrow since the day he walked forlorn and bedraggled into Rivendell some 700 years ago, his hand scarred by a Silmaril and his soul weeping for the weight of his crimes. Maglor does not do so now, either, although his brows are drawn in a frown and his dark eyes flicker with concern. The blackened hand hanging at his side makes an abortive movement, as though reaching for a sword that Maglor long ago ceased to wear. "What is wrong?" he asks Elrond, speaking not with words, but with the mental arts of Osanwe, which allows minds to meet and share thoughts that words sometimes cannot convey, or which they do not wish other ears to hear. Elrond had thought his own expression serene, his posture purged of the distress that fills his heart. He had thought that he had hidden away the worry that thrums like lightning through his veins before he crossed the threshold to this peaceful, homely house. He should have known better. Maglor raised Elrond since he was a small child, the only father he has more than a passing memory of. Of course Maglor would be able to read the worry on his face, his fea. Elrond thinks of smiling to offer reassurance, but does not. It would be a lie. "I would tell you and Arwen both together," Elrond says. He keeps his voice low, but he speaks aloud. He knows that Arwen will be able to overhear him even over the tumult of the children as they plan an encore concert of their own, arguing over which instruments to pull down from their shelves and to whose hands should be placed the lute, and whose the cymbals. Elrond does not wish to call her over to join them and draw the interest of the children too. This way Arwen will know she is needed, without the need to summon her. She hears. He can tell by the way her eyes flicker up toward him and Meglar, even as she smiles at the 7-year-old in front of her and hands over the panpipes she has pulled down from a shelf too high for short and grasping childish hands. Making her excuses with the grace of long practice, Ottoin extricates herself from the burgeoning orchestra and glides around discarded pillows and plush toys until she reaches the wall by which Elrond and his foster father stand. "What is wrong?" she asks, and Elrond does not try to lie to her either. "There is illness in the valley," he says, pitching his voice low to be sure the children cannot hear him over the noise of their own play. He looks at Meglar, who keeps lonely rooms at the top of this merry house, and asks, "Have any of the children displayed symptoms of any sickness lately?" Elrond is trying very hard not to worry about the fact that there are only 5 children gathered for the music today, when he knows that the Elros foster home currently houses 6. The other is a lad of 15, and might well be out on some ramble with other friends, or on one of those solitary walks that the riotous emotions of adolescence sometimes demand. There is no need to worry unduly. Not yet. The boy might be well, and simply not at home this afternoon. Maglor's ochre cheeks blanch, and Elrond's heart sinks. "Seannian," Meglar says, "come with me." Elrond and Ottoin follow him down the hall and up a staircase to the floor where most of the children have their rooms. Meglar knocks lightly on the frame of the 4th door down, but he does not wait for an answer before he presses inside. There is a boy on the bed, his cheeks flushed and his eyes drowsy. Elrond takes in the room around them, disordered with the usual detritus of childhood, but his eyes are drawn to the bloody tissues that fill the trash can beside the child's bed. He has a book propped up on his knees and another tissue stained with red held lightly to his face, as though to stem a slow nosebleed. But from the overflowing can of crimson, it is clear that while the bleeding is slow, it is also a bleeding that will not stop. Elrond swallows very hard, and makes himself muster up a smile. "Excuse me a moment," he murmurs, and steps back out into the hallway. As Meglar and Ottoin greet Seannian, speaking lightly about the book he is reading and whether he wants his window opened for a breeze or another blanket on his bed, Elrond pulls his phone from his pocket and dials the number of the Imladris Hospital Emergency Response Department. It is a matter of moments to convey the necessary information. His words are met with all appropriate urgency, and a poorly suppressed quiver of fear that he graciously pretends he has not heard. He hangs up and steps inside. "Good afternoon, Seannian," he says. Elrond hopes that he is doing a better job of concealing his own fear than the responder on the other end of the phone did theirs. "It has been a while since my last visit to your lovely home, I'm afraid. Do you remember me?"
"Elrond,"
the child says at once. His voice is hoarse, but steady.
"Nestando Elrond."
He sits up against his pillows, grinning.
You're Elladan and Elrohir's dad, and Arwen's.
Elrond smiles. Yes, he says. Could you hear the singing from up here? Seanian nods eagerly. Blood seeps from his nose and stains his lips. He wipes it away distractedly.
Nan Gilrain said I shouldn't go down with the other kids because of my fever.
Not for the first time in his long life, Elrond is filled with a profound rush of gratitude toward Gilrain Telcontar, the elderly human woman who is the current household head for the Elros foster home. His own sons founded the place, and Meglar has been a resident and assistant to the home since his own arrival in Rivendell, some 700 years ago. But neither Elladan nor Elrohir are currently in charge of running the day-to-day affairs of the house. They learned after only a few hundred years that the ability to distance themselves periodically was necessary for the sake of their own souls. While watching the mortal children they raised grow up and go on to have lives of their own was a never-ending joy, the sorrow of their inevitable deaths built up as well. It soon became painfully clear that it was best for everyone if the foster home was managed by a human or dwarf who understood mortality on an intrinsic level that neither elves nor Elrond's sons, who had lived all their lives among the elves, would ever understand or appreciate. Gilrain is the one who currently holds that role, and she has excelled at the position. She is both wise and kind, and has exactly as much steel in her spine as a mother ought. Elrond has been glad to know her, and gladder still to have her here overseeing the home of Rivendell's fosters. If this boy has indeed been kept isolated from the other children, perhaps he will be the only casualty here. It is not a pleasant thought to look at a face so young and think him doomed. It would be even less pleasant to look at 5 more faces beside his and know them all to be. That was probably a good decision, Elrond says lightly, continuing to smile at the child. Seanian, do you remember what I do? Where I work? Seanian rolls his eyes.
Yeah,
he says.
You're in charge of Imladris Hospital.
That is not technically correct, but it is close enough to accurate that Elrond does not think it worth correcting the child, not in the present circumstances. Instead, he nods and says, I think it would be helpful if we took you to the hospital to have your fever looked at. Would that be all right with you, Seanian?
Sure,
says Seanian.
I'm going to be an Asartha myself when I grow up, you know,
he declares with another bloody grin. He holds up his book to show Elrond the cover. It is a lurid Gondorian romance novel about human doctors falling in love with one another in Minas Tirith. Elrond is unfortunately far more familiar with the Tawdry series than he would like to be, because a certain friend whose sense of humor died in the fall of Gondolin has thought it exceedingly clever to gift Elrond copies of every installment published so far. Elrond makes himself smile, and tries not to imagine what the child will look like when he is lying strapped to his bed and biting at the air with blood-stained teeth. That is wonderful, Seanin, he makes himself say. Then this will be a sort of field trip for you, won't it?
Cool,
says Sianyan.
Can I bring my book?
The three of them keep the child talking, light and cheerful, until the emergency response team arrives. The Variandor bundle Sianyan up on a stretcher and carry him away, with two members of the team, one an elf and the other a heavily gloved and masked dwarf, staying to examine and disinfect first Sianyan's room, and then the rest of the Elros foster home. Another has already begun testing the other children for signs of infection. Elrond tries not to wonder for how many of them it is already too late. He walks out into the yard to stand next to Arwen and Maglar. Together they watch the ambulance carrying Sianyan until it turns a corner and disappears from sight. Only then does Elrond ask his foster father, "Will you show me where they've been playing lately, please?" Maglar does not spend as much time with the children as Gilrain or the other caregivers, being by nature and history something of a recluse who prefers the solitude of his lonely tower room to lengthy socialization. But he is keenly observant, and from his windows he can see not just the sea to the west and the mountains to the east, but also the curve of the valley around him, and he has a sharp ear for the laughter of small voices. He does not have to follow the children to know where they tend to play. Maglar leads Elrond and Arwen to a park 2 blocks away. There is a ramp for skateboarding, and a set of swings, and a complicated climbing gym with a polished wooden slide. 3 children, 2 humans and a dwarf, are shrieking as they chase each other up and down the ladders. Elrond nods politely at their caretakers, sitting together in companionable silence on one of the nearby benches while the one knits and the other reads, but he does not stop. He has a feeling he is looking for something more infectious than playground equipment, although he makes a mental note to have it checked and disinfected later, just in case. There is no telling where all Sianyan may have been bleeding before Gilrain confined him to his room. The 2 Perithil and 1 elf walk to the edge of the park where the swaying flowers and short grass give way to the edge of the forest and a shallow stream. "Ah," says Elrond, a sinking feeling in his heart. He turns to Maglar. "I have an unpleasant favor to ask of you," he says. "Name it," says Maglar. "This illness, we believe it can spread through water. Elves can taste the corruption, we are told, and have an instinctive enough aversion to its taint that they will purge themselves of any liquid thus contaminated immediately, and thus take no harm from it. Dwarves, and likely humans as well, are almost certainly less sensitive, and may become sick from ingesting the infected liquid. I need to know if this stream may be where Sianyan was exposed. And you do not know if Perithil will be able to taste the corruption or not," Maglar finishes for him. Precisely, says Elrond. I am sorry to ask this of you. Nonsense, says Maglar, and kneels beside the stream. Do not swallow it, even if you taste nothing untoward, Elrond says hurriedly. It may be that you will not be able to recognize the corruption after all. I would not have you risk it. Maglar's face goes blank. Of course, he says. One can never be sure how a Fëanorian will react to corruption, after all. It may taste perfectly natural to me, whatever its taint. His blackened hand flexes involuntarily, clutching into a sudden fist by his side. That is not it at all, Elrond snaps heatedly. We were told about this by an elf of Mirkwood, and I am thus unsure if the ability to recognize the corruption by taste is a skill innate to all elves, or one that is peculiar to them alone. For they are a peculiar people, Maglar finishes for him, the ghost of a half-smile on his lips. His blackened hand relaxes. I see. Elrond scowls at his foster father and holds his arms over his chest, wounded that Maglar should think that Elrond would ever make such an outrageous and offensive statement about Fëanorians in general, and especially Maglar himself. Maglar does not comment, having obviously thought his own assumption justified. He, after all, is intimately familiar with the convergence of Fëanorians and corruption, but he should know by now that Elrond has no interest in the lofty judgments of Silmarils. It is Arwen who breaks through the sulky silence, asking, Why did you not bring this Mirkwood elf along to test the water then, Ada? If neither of us can detect anything untoward in the stream, I will ask him to come and taste it to be certain that it is clean. But Elrond hesitates, then admits, he is Odofor's grandson. Maglar grimaces and draws in his breath with a hiss. And Curufin slew Odofor's husband back in Doriath, so you were not sure how he would react to me. Prudent, Elrondo. I also recall that Odofor in his turn killed Curufin, Elrond points out. So I thought it best, for the sake of all parties, to maintain some distance, so long as it was possible. Maglar waves that concern off. If he was going to hold it against people for being related to those who had slain his kin for being kingslayers, he would have started a long time ago, and Elrond knows it. Still, there is no call to press the issue by forcing Legolas and Maglar to interact yet. And it will be good to know if the instinctive recognition of this contagion is something natural to all elves rather than the dwellers of Mirkwood alone. Maglar leans down and cups his unmarred hand in the water, drawing it up to his lips and drinking, and immediately retches, dropping down to land with both palms planted in the mud at the edge of the stream as he heaves and coughs. Arwen is beside him before Elrond can move, holding her adoptive grandfather by the shoulder and keeping him from falling forward the rest of the way into the narrow stream as his weaker arm gives out under the strain and crumples beneath him. They draw back from the water together, and Maglar shudders. His dark eyes are distant, and his face is drawn and wan.
"I would say,"
he rasps once he has mustered enough breath with which to speak again,
"that the stream is contaminated, and I can indeed detect the corruption in it, yes."
"What does it taste like?" Otwin asks.
"Death," whispers Maglar. "Death and ashes and salt sea air."
He shudders again as Elrond kneels and cups the cool water in his hand. "Ada, what are you doing?"
"Elrond, stop!"
Elrond looks at them coolly.
"I need to know if I can taste it or not," he says calmly. "I do not intend to swallow it either way. Do not worry."
Otwin frowns at him, but Maglar gives a resigned sigh and waves in understanding.
"Go on, then," he says, "but know that you will regret it if you can." "At least I will know," says Elrond, and sips the water. Maglar was right. It does taste of death, but not of ashes, nor of the sea. Even as he doubles over, sputtering and heaving, Elrond is reminded so pointedly of the long, terrible days of the last alliance that he almost feels as though he has been suddenly transported back to the plains of Dagorland. He feels as though he can taste the blood and rot upon the air again, as though Mordor's black dust is once more sticking to his teeth and catching in his lungs with every breath. He feels as though his very skin is crawling once more beneath the filling of that dreaded, long-dead shadow. The memory is more jarring than the retching. Otwin hauls him upright and braces him as he wipes his mouth with one shaking hand. The taste and the memories it brings lingers in a way that makes him want to shout and weep. "Thank you," he murmurs, and she nods.
"Well," Otwin says, her fair face grim, "I cannot tell you both how much I'm looking forward to tasting that now."
"No!"
Elrond cries, almost in unison with Maglar's own protest.
"Otwin, please, there is no need."
"No?" Otwin raises her eyebrows. "You do not think it will be good for me to know that taste too? To be wary of it?"
"You do not need to know," Elrond assures her. "If you ever find yourself in a position where you drink such a thing by accident, believe me, you will know it at once."
Otwin's mouth thins into a stubborn line that makes her look startlingly like her mother. "I still think it would be prudent for me to taste it."
"Unnecessary," says Maglar. His melodic voice is terse, clipped, and his amber face is still pale. "You've as much elven blood as your father. If he can detect the corruption, and he clearly can, then you can too. There is no need for further unpleasant experimentation."
Otwin's jaw is still set mulishly, but she nods. "Fine," she says, But I want it noted that I was the one trying to be prudent, and you two were both too sensitive to permit the pragmatic course of action for once."
"Duly noted," McLaura says with a grave nod. "I will confirm it myself if your brothers doubt you when you tell them the tale," Elrond assures her. "For the moment," he continues, "would you do me the favor of calling this contamination in and getting an emergency response team out here to close off access to the stream and test how far the taint has spread?" He climbs to his feet, and they both scramble to join him. "Wait here and wave off anyone else who shows interest in getting close to the water in the meantime," Elrond continues. "Please?"
"What will you be doing?"
"Maglara and I will proceed upstream and see if we can determine anything about a possible source for the contamination before the response team arrives."
Arwen makes a face, but does not argue. "Fine," she says, and pulls her phone out of her pocket. "But don't either of you do anything stupid without me."
"My doing stupid thing days are long behind me," Maglara assures her, and moves off into the brush.
Arwen snorts, but does not reply. She is already speaking into the phone, her voice crisp with urgency but clear of fear. Elrond pauses long enough to give her a proud smile, then follows Maglara deep into the foliage that lines the stream. Eventually, they come to a wilder section of greenery, shadowed and thick with trees on both sides of the narrow twist of water. Their own steps are nearly silent on the leaves, the both of them moving in the light-footed grace of the Eldar. Elrond still feels faintly sick from the taste of the contaminated stream, and he wonders if Maglar is similarly nauseated, or if that is a particular side effect of his own complicated heritage. He opens his mouth to ask, and then goes still. There is a rustling in the leaves. He and Maglar need to exchange no more than a single glance to coordinate their response. Soundlessly, they each step to the side, opening a space between them through which a foe might flee or stage an attack. Neither of them are armed, and Elrond regrets that now as he remembers Legolas's words about Mirkwood's hungry dead. He should have brought a sword before he went scouting into the forest beside a tainted stream, but he has not carried a blade in Rivendell since Sauron fell nearly 3,000 years before. It had not occurred to him to start now, and he knows without asking that Maglar bears none. He has not worn a weapon once, at least not openly, since he set foot in this peaceful valley. Even here, there are still those who are leery of Feanorians, and Maglar has been extremely solicitous toward those tensions. It is guilt, more than any concern for the feelings of others, that drives him to be so conscientious, of course,
but Elrond has never chided him for that. He knows that his foster father has done a great deal of deeds that merit guilt. Now Maglar leans sideways and plucks a long, heavy stick from a pile of tumbled branches and brambles. He slides into a combat stance, his improvised weapon held confidently in his good hand, while he raises the charred husk of the other in a defensive block. Elrond glances to the side to see if he can spy a likely weapon of his own, but just then the leaves ahead of him give a sudden flutter, and out of them lurches the small form of a hobbit. Elrond drops his hands, startled, and gapes at the little figure. It looks terrible, with dirt and something darker that looks far too much like dried blood smeared across its skin and splattered dark across its tattered, thorn-rent clothes. There is a terrible look in its eyes, milky and distant, but Elrond is too distracted by the way it moves to pay much attention to its features. The hobbit lurches terribly and almost falls as it steps forward. One leg is broken so badly that Elrond can see bone poke out through the side. He draws a breath in horror and starts forward, reaching for the injured hobbit. It is astonishing that the poor thing is even walking with a wound like that, although in truth, it is more falling than anything else, and it moans and topples forward even as Elrond stoops and reaches for it. And teeth, sharp and terrible, close on his hand. Elrond jerks backward with a cry of shock as much as pain, trying to tear himself free from the small, bloody jaws. Maglar is suddenly there beside him, the stick in his hands swinging down to smash the hobbit's head from the side, the angle calculated to knock the teeth open rather than force them further closed. The hobbit goes down, back into the brambles, and with the heightened awareness of adrenaline racing through his veins and painting every leaf and twig around him with crystalline clarity, Elrond can see now how the thorny vines have tangled around the hobbit, trapping the small limbs. Likely it has been stuck there in this accidental den for some time, given the gashes that are torn through both its skin and its garments, and the way the brush is all tangled around its hairy, blood-stained feet. Elrond wonders if the hobbit broke its own leg trying to tear itself free, or if the injury predates its arrival in the valley. Ordinarily, such a wound left untreated would be fatal in only a few hours. But, well, in this case it may not have made much difference, because it is not only the bramble that Elrond can see more clearly now, but also the hobbit itself. There is no question that it is dead. It lurches up anyway, moaning and reaching for them both. Maglar steps forward and brings his stick down again in another hard blow, and this time the hobbit's small and rotting skull splits beneath the heavy wood. Elrond steps back across the narrow stream and sits down heavily, staring at the dead, and now unmoving, body. "Bilbo Baggins," he mumbles. "Iluvatar's grace, no. That is Bilbo Baggins." "Bilbo," Maglar exclaims. "The poet?" Elrond knows that they met a few times on Bilbo's occasional trips to Rivendell, although Maglar was not in town for Bilbo's first and most memorable visit. He has heard the story of it, though, and has heard many of Bilbo's poems and tales in the years since. He does not know him as well as Elrond does not know anyone as well as Elrond does, for Maglor is a reclusive soul who often spends whole weeks alone in his rooms at the top of the Elros foster home, speaking to no one, not even Elrond himself. But Elrond knows that he always liked the smart-mouthed hobbit's poetry, and liked his sharp wits even more. Not everyone is willing to speak amiably to a Feanorian. Even fewer are willing to trade insulting banter with one, and that is an art at which Bilbo was always particularly skilled. Maglor's voice is sad as he leans in closer to the twice-dead corpse and asks, "Are you sure?" "No," Elrond says after a moment's reflection. "No, he is too young for Bilbo. Much too young, in fact, and his hair is too dark. But he looks like Bilbo, a great deal like him." Elrond feels his heart twist in his chest as he stares at the small, broken hobbit, and says heavily, "Bilbo's nephew. Frodo, that is his name. That is who this must be, must have been." "Thou," says Maglar. His face shows the strain of one who knows all too well what the pain of losing one's family feels like. "Bilbo will be devastated." Elrond stares at the old bite wounds on Frodo's arms, the marks small enough to have been made by a hobbit's mouth. He stares at Frodo's ravaged hand, with its missing finger. His own injured hand throbs in sympathy. "I think," he says quietly, "that he perhaps may not be." Maglar looks at the fetid wounds. "Ah," he says. He closes his eyes and whispers a quiet, ancient prayer for the spirits of both the hobbits. Elrond does not pray with him. He is too preoccupied with staring at the body, and the way the bloodied bramble snakes forward down the narrow, muddy bank. No doubt this small, rotting corpse is the source of the contamination that has befouled this thin stream, that has sent young Seannian to his doom. The stream will have to be checked to see how far the corruption has spread, and whether the hobbit is the only dead thing leaking poison into its waters. The patients currently in Imladra's hospital will have to be consulted. They, or in the cases of those too far gone to speak, their families, to determine whether this is the sole source of infection in the valley, or if there are others yet to be discovered. The populace will have to be warned of the danger, and all those who may have touched the water examined for this illness. It is such a small body to have caused so much suffering. Elrond finds himself staring at the bite wound on his own hand now. It too is a small thing, but deeper than one might have expected given the size of the mouth that tore into his flesh. But hobbits have strong jaws. Elrond knows this. He has treated many for illnesses and injury over the centuries. He has dined with many more. He knows this. The blood oozes thick and bright down his skin and drips on the lush grass. "Here," Maglar says, holding out his good arm for Elrond's wounded one. "I know you are the healer, not me, but we should rub that at least, surely, even if we don't want to risk rinsing it in this befouled water." Elrond does not move. He stares at the wound, at the bright bone and bloody flesh, and he swallows. Eventually he says, very quietly, "Bites are how the dead transfer their condition. Elves recover with little effort, apparently, at least as long as they have the contagion of only a few bites to contend with. Humans." He swallows again. He does not seem to be able to look away from the blood dripping from his arm. Humans die from a single bite in only a few hours. There is no cure or treatment for them. "Oh," says Maglar. He stares at Elrond. His tree-lit eyes are very bright. "Oh, and you do not know what will be the case for Perithil." Elrond manages to nod. "Perhaps if I sang a cantrip for... We were told that the elves of Mirkwood could find no treatment that affected this disease," Elrond says. His voice sounds harsh to his own ears, his throat dry. He swallows and tries again, more gently. "While I would hesitate to draw the conclusion that this means there is no cure that may be devised by those better versed in either the healing arts or in the progress of modern innovation in general, I think I can say with confidence that they would at least have tried every healing cantrip they knew. A song is not going to help, I am afraid, and we have as of yet devised no other sort of cure." "I'm sorry," Maglar says. He looks miserable, even worse than Elrond himself feels. Elrond tries to muster a smile for him, and fails. He swallows instead, and tries not to let himself stare too much at the twice-dead hobbit. "It is for the best, I think," he says. "I confess that I was gripped by a terrible fear when I thought that such a cure might indeed exist. There are so few today who are capable of such songs. If we had to rely on that for our only treatment, we would lose too many lives to lack of ability." He shakes his head. His vision wavers a little with the motion, but it soon steadies again. Elrond swallows hard to steady his voice as well. I would much rather we devise a cure or vaccine that can be replicated and shared widely than have one which can be administered only by a narrow few. Maglar does not say that in such a case he would be one of those few, and Elrond would already be recovering under the curative powers of his melodies. But Elrond can see in his eyes how much he wishes it was so. There is a small part of Elrond that wishes the same right now. I have not suffered from human ailments since I was a small child, as you no doubt recall as well as I do, he eventually reminds his foster father. His voice does not shake. He is quite pleased by that. I do indeed, says Maglar. His own voice is light, but the curve of his mouth is heavy. I was quite distressed the first few times one or the other of you caught some passing mortal sickness, you will remember. I do not remember you ever ceasing to be distressed, Elrond says. He feels as though he is very far away from the words. Very far away even from his own body. Maglar does not laugh, but he does manage a smile. True, he says. The smile vanishes. Elrond, will you sit with me? Elrond asks softly. Until I know. Of course. Maglar moves immediately to his side. Elrond turns his eyes away from the small, sad corpse. That will have to be dealt with, but later. There are many things that will have to be dealt with later, by someone. Whether that someone will be Elrond or not, well, he will know soon enough, he supposes. From the corner of his eye, Elrond sees Maglar lay the stick that killed the dead hobbit beside him, in easy reach of his good arm. Elrond feels some of the tension that grips him relax a little at the sight of the ready weapon. There is no one with whom he trusts his life, nor his death, more than the mournful elf who raised him. He knows that Maglar will not permit him to hurt anyone, no matter what comes next. There is a solace in that, here, among the shadows of Rivendell's gentle trees. It is a terrible thing that he is asking of his foster father, he knows. But Maglar has done many terrible things in his long life, most of them for reasons much less noble than a mercy killing. Elrond knows that if the darkness takes him, Maglar will not falter. He might hesitate. Elrond would never ask someone not to hesitate when faced with the doing of such a terrible thing. And he will surely weep after, for this fresh and grievous wound upon his oft-scarred soul. But he will not falter. He loves Elrond too much to falter. Maglar lifts his other arm, the one ruined long ago by the weight of all those terrible deeds, and pulls his son in tight against him, as though Elrond was once again a small boy waking from a nightmare and needing comfort. Elrond lays his bloody hand in his lap and stares at the seeping wound. Together, they wait for the blood to stop flowing. Coming up, comfort in the sun.